Hi again then guys, and welcome to another installment of the Beards and Cars podcast, which incidentally is not available as a podcast this week. This is only on YouTube because it's a very visual-centric installment, and it was actually suggested by a member of the community. Many of you will know him as Louis on the Discord server, LDNT in the livery competition, and of course the photo mode competitions every week as well. And he suggested this topic, which is a great one, which is why I decided to do it today. And it's my favourite, your favourite, our favourite, liveries from the racing world. Now, you don't necessarily need to make it a racing livery. It could be a production car special edition livery or something like that as well. But most of mine, if not all of them, are racing liveries. And as far as imposing rules on what you can and can't choose, well, that's the great thing about it. There aren't really any. You could choose a road car, you could choose a race car, a rally car, a NASCAR, whatever the case may be, and I could easily make a list of motorbikes as well, but I'm deciding to stick just to cars for this particular countdown, and I'm also incidentally not doing this in any particular order, because even though I absolutely have my top 5 favourite liveries, the rest of them are very fluid, so there's not really much point in me ordering these because my opinions change all over the place. And incidentally, the reason why I'm doing a top 15 is because I was unable, basically, to make it a top 10. There were just too many that I wanted in there that would not have been able to because I love all of these so much. So for me, I was able to condense this down to 15, just barely, with one honourable mention in there as well, which is incidentally the BMW E92 M3 art car, which of course was featured in Forza. It's a very iconic modern livery, a one-off, as I said, not a team livery, generally speaking, not even like a specific sponsor, just a livery really for the sake of looking nice. I love that. It's not quite on the list for me, but it's definitely a very, very pretty livery on a great car as well. And kicking us off, first of all, is one of a couple of vehicles, actually, which put together a kind of my main inspirations, actually, for Team HSG livery, and the colours even of the channel. This one, less in terms of the colours and more in terms of the shapes. It's the Hugo Boss livery on the Porsche 962. I love 80s liveries, especially pinstripe stuff, and there are a couple with this kind of design on the list. I'm sure you can think of at least one car that has a livery like this, which of course is a very iconic touring car, which I will actually feature later on down this list as well. And that one, along with this car, and also Bimota, motorcycle livery as well, are the 3 biggest inspirations for Team HSG livery. Stunning looking car, not necessarily the most famous of Porsche 962s, certainly not as famous as like Rothmans or even Jägermeister, but I do love this livery and it's kind of an undervalued one, I think. Next one up on the list is probably my top 5, one of my top 5 favourite liveries, because it's so weird. It's out there, it's on a car which not many people talk about, generally speaking. I actually commissioned a player to make me this one on the Jaguar XJR9, and it's probably my single favourite livery that I've got in GT Sport, and that is the March 83G race car, specifically with the Red Lobster livery. I absolutely love these colours. I think it's a great looking design. It suits the shape of the car. The fact that the car, I don't think actually has any headlights, which of course makes the shape of the lobster even more accentuated. I love it. I think it looks fantastic. It suits the Jaguar a lot as well, as you'll have probably seen if you watched my, I think it was review for that car, or maybe the Rival Showdown. Yeah, I love it. This is easily top 5. This might actually be top 3, maybe even my favourite livery ever. And even though it's certainly not the most iconic of liveries, I do love it because of the colours. I love how out there and how wacky it is, and also kind of how undervalued it is as far as liveries go. Next up on the list, though, to the surprise of precisely no one when it comes to a countdown of iconic racing liveries or favourite racing liveries, you've pretty much got to have Golf on there at some point, and for me, it's very specific. My favourite car to feature Golf livery is also my favourite LMP car, my favourite Le Mans prototype of all time, not the Ford GT40, which of course is the obvious choice. Actually, it's an Aston Martin, the Aston Lola B09-60, the car which I wish had won Le Mans. I believe a stunning looking car, and it really suits the colours. It's perfect for the shape, the tones of the orange and the blue look fantastic. I absolutely love it. I love Golf on the GT40 as well, but to me this one is where it was basically perfected. Next up, I'm actually featuring another hugely iconic livery, one of the most iconic Le Mans liveries of all time for sure, especially amongst Gran Turismo players. Again, no surprise to anyone, the Mazda 787B. Specifically the Renown livery. The orange and green, sometimes it looks more like a red and green depending on which car you see. Of course, it's iconic. It has a special place to me as well because it was my dad's favourite car ever, and he absolutely loved the livery on it. Yeah, it's so recognisable, so iconic, even though it's not as widespread as something like a Gulf or a Martini or Rothmans or Silk Cut. It's easily as iconic as any of those, and it continues to be used. Even on road cars, you'll see people wrapping like RX-7s and MX-5s and RX-8s, and it looks great on all of them, and appropriate as well. Next up for me is another certainly iconic livery, but also more of a novelty one, and I've always loved it for that, in a similar way to the Red Lobster, also animal themed, and many of you will of course be familiar with this one. I believe it had a relatively recent resurgence on a Porsche 911 RSR, but my favourite is the original. Of course, I'm referring to the Butcher's Special, the Porsche 917 Pink Pig. And for those who don't know, what this livery is referencing is a butcher's grid of where you make certain cuts on a pig. So, of course, people call Porsches porkers sometimes, so the reference to pig is fairly self-explanatory. But for those who maybe didn't get the joke, that is basically what it is. I love the livery. It's very simple but very cool. It's unusually tongue-in-cheek for Germans, and I like it for that. And to me, I would choose this over like a Rothmans livery any day, even though that's sacrilege. Next up, though, I'm moving to something totally different, and probably not a livery which many other people would have on their lists, because it's relatively simple. It is very iconic in its own way. You certainly know what car it is when you see it, but I think many people probably wouldn't put it in their top, maybe even 50, let alone top 15, and that is actually Cadillac team colours, specifically on stuff like the CTSV race car. It's basically a silver car, as you would usually see a Cadillac in, if you chose that colour at least, and it has the multicoloured rectangles, which kind of mimic a larger version of the Cadillac logo. And to me, I love it. It's clean, it's simple, it's classy. I love Cadillacs. Cadillac is actually one of my top 5 favourite brands. I love it when they go racing because it always feels special, kind of like when Bentley does it. And yeah, I just love the livery. I love it on the, I believe it's ATSV as well, which I think has a black version, if I recall correctly. But yeah, there's multiple different variations, but this essential theme is one of my favourites for sure. Next up on the list is another very undervalued livery, I think. I remember the first time I saw this one was actually on a model car in the window of a shop. I'd never seen it before. I was very familiar with the car at the time. I was a kid, probably like 12 or 13, and I'd seen the car in Gran Turismo 4, but never this livery before, and I loved how artistic and how weird and wacky it was. And I don't think the car itself had as much success as some, but it is of course the Audi R8 LMP from the earlier 2000s, but specifically the crocodile livery. I don't really know anything about the backstory of this car or how it did in racing, but I just think it looks awesome. It's such a creative idea to use that central nose cone and like the driver's pod, if you will, of the car's design, which runs all the way down the centre, to have this crocodile shape like swimming through the water. It's such a cool little fun idea, in a similar way to the Red Lobster and the Pink Pig. It's not as famous as those, but I really, really like the ingenuity of this design. And funnily enough, the next car on the list has a similar kind of vibe to it as well. It's a little bit more famous though, thanks to Forza, and those of you who have played, for instance, Forza Motorsport 3 and 4, you'll probably remember this car. It was badged as a Chevy, but I believe it was technically a Team Oreca car, an Oreca chassis, and it is the Oreca FLM09 LMP car. I believe an LMP2, a very large engine for an LMP2. It was like a 6.2 litre V8 or something. But specifically the Green Earth Team Gunnar. Gunnar, of course, have been featured in Unsung Heroes here on the channel, but a very different car. This one to me just looks really cool. It's very similar in some ways to the Audi Crocodile. It's got those little teeth on the front, of course, that strong green coming through. A lot more green than the Audi though. And again, I just love how creative it is. Half of the cars that I love tend to be like distinctive teams or brands, and the other half of the liveries that I love tend to be stuff that's just purely artistic and creative. And even though stuff like the BMW Art car tends to get most of that attention, I prefer vehicles like this, which are just as over the top, but a little bit more fun and a little bit more funny, rather than just art. The next one on the list for me is actually the only Formula One car to feature in my top 15, and I know that for many of you guys that'll probably be very, very different. So many people love many iconic Formula teams. For me though, there's only one choice. My favourite F1 livery ever. The 2004 Jaguar Team HSBC. I love these colours, I love the green, I love the white. Usually I couldn't care less about if a bank was advertised on the side of a car, but just the colours really suit it. I love the fact that Jaguar was in F1, again just like Bentley at Le Mans and Cadillac in whatever racing they do these days, DPI I guess. I love the fact that Jaguar was in the mix at all. It's just inherently cool to me to have a team like that. But the livery looks stunning as well. There are many, many iconic F1 cars, but this one is without question my favourite. Next up, I'm featuring a car which most Gran Turismo players will be very familiar with. This was probably my favourite car in Gran Turismo 4. Not now, but back when I was playing it, I used to use this thing all the time. I had thousands upon thousands of miles on it. I used it all the time if I could in career mode, and it is a Pescarolo. Not the hybrid and not the standard Team Peugeot, which I also love, the green and blue, but in particular, the Team PlayStation. I always used to call this one the ice cream swirl, because on the back of the car, behind the driver's head, on like the buttress area above the engine, it's got this swirl of blues, and I think it's blues and purples, which looks kind of like an ice cream to me. And I just love the colours. I love the way they clash. I love how, again, artistic it looks, like the Gun R or the Crocodile Audi, but with a much more professional, no-nonsense kind of scheme. It's not designed to look funny or cute or ironic in any way. It's just a strong colour. I love all of Pescarolo's colours. They're always stunning-looking cars. Even something like the Peugeot 908 with the Pescarolo colours, which is fairly similar to this. But yeah, this is absolutely one of my favourites, and I think part of the reason why I love it so much is because of how fantastic this car was with that GV5 V10 engine in particular in Gran Turismo 4. Next up for me is another livery which I believe is strongly undervalued. And maybe it's just because people don't like it as much as I do, but I think a lot of people totally forget about this one, because as far as I know, it wasn't actually used in racing that much, and it tended to be used more in concept cars. Peugeot has already featured on the list, incidentally, with Pescarolo and the reference to the 908, but there was a period of time in the mid to later 2000s when Peugeot concept cars had a very specific design style, and it was used on 3 vehicles in particular, which I love the design of. There was the 207R Cup, the 20 Cup, which was a 3-wheeler, like an Ariel Atom kind of rival, and most notably to me, the concept, the original concept of what would later become the Peugeot 908 LMP1 car, which I still believe is the most beautiful version. Of course, it wasn't race ready, but the basic shape of that LMP concept, as you can see here in the video, was absolutely stunning. And to me, I love this livery because it's so simple and so clean, just that pure bright white and the strong, vibrant red. But I love it. As I said, I don't think Peugeot really used this livery that much, at least not that I've seen. But I absolutely love it. I think it's a gorgeous looking livery. Again, you can see many of my favourite colours tend to come up again and again. The red and the white, for instance, of the Red Lobster, even Team HSG, this car, Bimota. So it's definitely a theme, at least in many of the cars that I love. But yeah, I think that Peugeot livery from this era is very underappreciated, and I think it looks stunning. Next up for me, we're staying in the relatively simple design style mode, but the livery of one of my favourite racing manufacturers, especially when it comes to rallying, and they actually made my favourite rally car of all time, and I am of course referring to Skoda. Team Skoda racing colours, the white and green. It's evolved over the years to be a brighter, more vibrant green instead of that more dull, I would call like a British green, almost originally. My favourite rally car is the mid-2000s Fabia WRC. I absolutely adore that car. The way it drives, the way it looks, the way it sounds, and of course the livery as well. And even today, the Fabias now have a very similar livery, of course, because that's their colours, but with the much stronger green. And I love how 90s those colours look, which I really like in the case of that car. You instantly know what a car is if it's green and white. That's Skoda all the way. I love it. I've got it on my Scirocco in Gran Turismo Sport. I love those colours. The next one for me returns to the world of Le Mans though, to another surprisingly undervalued livery, I think, on a car which somewhat ironically is also undervalued as well, despite I believe having quite a bit of success. The Porsche RS Spider, an LMP2 car just like the Oreca FLM09. Any older Forza player will remember this one very well because it's such a good car. Probably the best all-round LMP2 in the game. The sheer ability of this car notwithstanding, I love the livery. The Team DHL bright yellow with red accenting. For those who don't know, yellow is my favourite colour, and even though I love red and white, of course I'm going to love a car that has so much yellow, but also, to boot, is a very pretty car anyway. The RS Spider is a stunning machine, and it really complements the colour. Next up, we come to the car which I referenced earlier on, alongside the Hugo Boss Porsche 962, and it is of course one of the other main inspirations for Team HSG, and a livery which many of you probably love as well, especially if you're maybe in your 30s or 40s and you're a touring car fan. Of course, the Mercedes 190E in Sonax colours. The silver, and I guess you could say black. It's always had kind of a graphite slate black kind of look to it with a little bit of a metallic tinge. Stunning looking colours, again, so iconic. You can put these colours on any car. There are even some renderings of a modern Mercedes LMP with these colours, and it looks incredible. I'll probably put a couple of those in the video as well. But yeah, I mean, it's one of the most iconic touring car liveries ever, for sure. Such an iconic car that it's on. It suits it. It's unapologetically retro. Again, I love the 80s pinstripe style, and this one very strongly influenced what Team HSG colours have become, especially in more recent times. And last, but definitely not least on my list, a car which is a little bit more obscure. It's certainly not the most famous livery on this car, that's for sure, but it's a livery which I first saw in GT Sport, funnily enough. A player created this livery on a Ferrari GTO, the 288, and I used it, I believe, in my review for that car, at least in the thumbnail, and many people absolutely loved it. It suits the Ferrari, but of course it originated on a BMW, and it is the IMSA livery on the BMW M1, I believe from 1978. It's black with like an orange, red and yellow accenting. Again, kind of a pinstripe design, similar to Hugo Boss or Sonax. Nowhere near as famous as those though, especially not the Mercedes, but I love it. Again, so retro, it really looks its age, even older with the stronger oranges and yellows. I love it. It's not famous compared to many of the others, but I really, really like this livery. And ultimately, that's it for my top 15. I believe that many of you have probably got variations of these themes in there. Certainly many of you will have Golf. A lot of people probably have stuff like the HSBC Jaguar, maybe the Pink Pig Porsche. A couple of them might have surprised you, and a few of them are definitely more obscure, like the Team Gunnar and the Crocodile Audi. But yeah, I would say that overall my two favourite types of livery tend to be the ones that are either like a red and white, really clean, clear-cut, distinctive style, or you could replace the red with a green, for instance, in the case of Skoda, for instance, or on the other hand, I love liveries that just go out of their way to be wacky. The Red Lobster, the Pink Pig, the Crocodile Audi, the Team Gunnar, those kind of things that are just completely over the top, like a Hot Wheels livery, if you will. I love both ends of the spectrum. Might surprise you that something like Rothmans, or of course Martini, which many people love, is actually not on my list. I've never been a fan of Martini. I'm not sure why, I just don't like it, which is funny because it's very similar to a lot of the ones that I do love, but there's just something about it that I don't like. Ultimately though, that's it for my top 15. Slap yours down below. It doesn't have to be 15. You could do more, you could do less. And ultimately, that is it for this installment. So of course, I'll see you guys next week. Tell me your favourites down below, and until then, I'll see you next time. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.